Most people think of Iran through a narrow set of familiar images: nuclear negotiations, carpet bazaars, turquoise domes, desert cities, and Persian poetry. But beneath that surface lies a country layered with far stranger and darker stories, some of them so unsettling that even modern science has struggled to explain them fully. Iran is not simply a nation on a map. It is a historical palimpsest where every century has built itself on top of what came before. Temples rose over older temples. Cities expanded over the bones of previous cities. Roads followed routes first traced by caravans thousands of years ago. In Iran, the past is rarely sealed behind museum glass. It pushes through the soil, appears inside construction pits, and rises out of the earth whenever someone digs too deeply. That is what makes Iran so unnerving and so fascinating at the same time. Beneath its architecture, poetry, and refined visual culture lies another country made of buried rituals, forgotten catastrophes, abandoned settlements, and geological behavior that can turn entire neighborhoods into ruins without warning. Some of these stories belong to archaeology, others belong to geology, some hover uneasily between myth and explanation. Together, they reveal a side of Iran that many outsiders never see. One of the most disturbing examples stands on the outskirts of Yazd, where two low stone hills rise from the desert. At first glance, they look like ordinary formations, easy to ignore if you do not know what they once were. But at the top of each sits a circular stone platform with a shallow pit in the center. These are dakmas, or towers of silence, Zoroastrian funerary structures. What happened on these platforms for centuries is among the most unsettling burial practices in human history. Zoroastrians, followers of one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths, regarded earth, water, and fire as sacred elements that should not be polluted by dead flesh. Burial in the ground would contaminate the soil. Cremation would defile fire. Casting bodies into water was unthinkable. That left one solution: expose the dead to birds. Corpses were carried to the top of the towers and laid out on the stone surface. Men in the outer ring, women in the middle, children closer to the center. Then came the vultures. In only a few hours, sometimes less, the birds stripped the flesh from the bones. Special attendants later gathered the remains and dropped them into the central pit, where sun, wind, and time reduced them to dust. What is most shocking is not only the ritual itself, but how recently it survived. The Towers of Silence in Yazd remained in active use into the 1960s, and the Iranian government did not officially ban the practice until 1970. That means there are still living people who remember seeing vultures circling above those towers during funerals. Elder residents of Yazd later recalled that on burial days a distinctive smell drifted over the nearby city, unmistakable to anyone who had grown up there. Some researchers have suggested that in remote Zoroastrian communities, the practice continued quietly even after the ban, carried out at night to avoid official attention. Records survive from the community of Yazd describing the work of the Nasa Salars, hereditary corpse bearers whose task passed from father to son. These men were respected, but also feared. Under ritual purity laws, they could not freely touch ordinary people without undergoing cleansing procedures. One of the last recorded NASA Salars later recalled that winter was the worst season. Vultures arrived reluctantly, bodies froze on the stone, and a process that took hours in summer could stretch into a full day. He described standing alone on the tower in the dark, wrapped in sheepskin against the cold wind, speaking aloud to the dead simply because there was no one else there. There is another layer to the story that guidebooks rarely mention. As vulture populations in Iran declined because of urbanization, habitat pressure, and poison exposure, the ritual itself began to fail in practical terms. Too few birds meant that bodies remained exposed too long, and the smell spread into surrounding neighborhoods. This was one of the reasons authorities eventually ended the practice. Today, the Towers of Silence have become historical sites. Visitors can climb the paths, stand on the platforms, and look into the empty central pits. The bones are gone. The rituals have ended. But in the desert wind, the imagination fills the silence easily. A very different mystery lies in an abandoned village in the mountains of Khorasan. Ruined mud brick houses stand there with collapsed roofs and empty doorways, little different at first from many other old settlements in Iran's interior. But local people from neighboring villages refuse to go near the place after sunset. According to legend, the village was cursed centuries ago after its inhabitants murdered a wandering dervish who had asked for water and shelter. As he died, he supposedly declared that the land would never again give proper harvests, that the wells would turn bitter, and that shadows of the unborn would wander between the houses at night. Legends like this are easy to dismiss until the physical environment is considered. Some researchers believe a geological fault runs beneath the village, releasing sulfurous gases through cracks in the ground. In certain concentrations, such gases can cause dizziness, fear, headaches, and hallucinations. If trapped in enclosed spaces or carried unpredictably by shifting air, they may produce sensations people interpret as supernatural. In Iranian folklore, such places are often linked to jinn, invisible beings made of smokeless fire who are believed to inhabit ruins, wells, caves, and abandoned buildings. Even highly educated Iranians may still instinctively avoid such spaces after dark, not necessarily because they reject science, but because daily life in such a landscape leaves room for both rational and inherited explanations. This tension between explanation and dread appears again in a far older and more chilling discovery. In 2006, speleologists exploring caves in South Khorasan found a hidden chamber behind a narrow passage. Inside were wall images painted in ochre and charcoal, human figures, animals, and hybrid beings with human bodies and bull-like heads. But the most disturbing feature lay deeper inside. In a separate stone chamber, the explorers found dozens of human skulls arranged carefully along the walls. Some showed clear signs of trepanation, an ancient surgical procedure in which a hole is cut into the skull. The skulls dated from roughly 5 to 7,000 years ago, making them among the oldest signs of trepanation known in the wider region. More astonishing still, some of the skulls showed evidence of healing around the openings. That means the patients survived the operation. Thousands of years ago, somewhere in what is now Iran, people were performing skull surgery without modern anesthesia, sterile instruments, or anything resembling contemporary neurosurgery, and some patients lived. Even stranger, not all of the perforations had been made on living people. Some skulls appear to have been opened only after death. Why cut into the skull of a corpse? Some anthropologists suggest it may have been a ritual intended to release the spirit. Others point to the circular arrangement of the skulls and imagine some kind of subterranean cult chamber or temple of the dead. A harsher interpretation sees a chamber of trophies. But that theory becomes more difficult when women's and children's skulls appear among the remains. The cave has not yet yielded all its answers. For now, it remains a sealed question in stone. Who performed these operations, and for what purpose? Another dark layer of Iran's buried history lies beneath the ancient city of Hamadan, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world and once the capital of the Median Kingdom. Set on a high plateau with mountain air, water access, and fertile soil, Hamadan would seem like the ideal site for long-term urban life. But its position also placed it directly on major trade routes between east and west. Those same routes that carried silk, spice, and wealth also carried plague. As caravans moved across the Silk Road, they brought with them not only goods, but fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. When epidemic waves struck Hamadan, the city suffered terribly. Medieval chroniclers describe streets filled with bodies, houses where entire families died within days, and dogs growing wild because they had become used to feeding on the dead. When the number of corpses overwhelmed the capacity of ordinary cemeteries, authorities ordered the digging of mass graves outside the city walls. Over time, dozens and perhaps hundreds of burial pits were created around Hamadan. Bodies were lowered in layers, covered with lime, and then sealed beneath earth. As centuries passed, the exact locations of many of these plague pits were forgotten. The city expanded, neighborhoods spread outward, and new buildings rose directly above the graves of those who had died in earlier epidemics. In the 20th century, when water lines and sewer systems were installed, workers repeatedly uncovered layers of human bones just 1 or 2 meters below the surface. In some places, the discoveries were so large that construction stopped for days or weeks. Historians estimate that plague outbreaks could destroy 30 to 60% of a city's population during severe episodes. Hamadan endured that kind of catastrophe more than once, each time the city repopulated through migration from surrounding areas. People moved into homes and districts without realizing they were building over the dead of previous generations. In that sense, Hamadan became a city literally resting on unmarked layers of epidemic memory. It remains one of those places where the ground beneath daily life contains a history too grim and too vast to be fully marked by monuments. A very different secret was uncovered in 2004 in the small town of Nushabad, usually rendered in English as Nushabad, in Isfahan province. A local resident was digging a well in his yard when the ground beneath him gave way and he fell into darkness. When neighbors helped pull him out and later returned with lights, they found not a simple cavity, but the entrance to an underground labyrinth. What followed was one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries in modern Iran, an entire subterranean city. The underground city of Nushabad extends through 3 levels, reaching depths of roughly 4 to 18 meters below ground. It consists of tunnels, chambers, shafts, storerooms, and ventilation systems carved into soft rock. Archaeologists believe much of it dates to the Sasanian period, roughly between the 3rd and 7th centuries AD, though some sections may have seen later reuse. The structure was not decorative, religious, or symbolic in the usual sense. It was defensive. The tunnels are intentionally narrow and low. In many sections, an adult has to stoop or crawl. This was not poor planning, it was tactical design. Invaders entering the passages would be forced into vulnerable positions where they could not swing weapons properly and could easily be attacked from above, or from hidden openings in the walls. Some passageways divide unexpectedly, with one path leading deeper into the city and another ending in a vertical shaft. In darkness, especially without local knowledge, an enemy could easily take the wrong route and fall into a trap. Archaeologists also found niches for oil lamps, water storage areas, and evidence of basic sanitation systems. This was not a simple hideout, it was a planned refuge capable of sheltering families during raids or military attacks. That interpretation became painfully human when one small artifact was found: a child's sandal. Worn small and made of rough leather, it may date back centuries. On its own, it is not a glamorous object, but it is perhaps the most emotionally revealing item from the entire underground city. It tells us that children were brought into these tunnels. Parents carried them below the earth, into the dark, not for ritual, but to save them from slaughter above. That single shoe turns the site from military architecture into lived fear. It evokes nights spent underground while horses moved overhead and violence unfolded on the surface. A subterranean city may sound like an engineering marvel, but in reality it was built around one brutally practical need: survival. The sixth mystery belongs to the Zagros Mountains, in a place locals call the Valley of the Jinn. During the day, it appears to be an ordinary narrow gorge with steep walls and a stream running through its base. At night, according to local accounts, the atmosphere changes. People from nearby villages describe hearing sounds that cannot easily be mistaken for ordinary wind or water. They speak of a low droning resonance, rhythmic knocking from deep inside the rock, and at times something like a monotonous chant without words. Livestock reportedly become agitated before the sounds are fully audible to humans, and many local herders refuse to bring animals into the valley after sunset. Rational explanations do exist. Geologists point to the presence of underground cavities in Zagros rock formations. As temperatures shift, the stone expands and contracts, creating cracking or percussion-like noises. Water moving through narrow channels can generate strange, resonant hums, and wind passing through openings in rock can produce sustained tones that sound eerily vocal. These are all known physical phenomena. Yet several years ago, Iranian researchers monitoring the valley with recording equipment detected something more difficult to explain. Along with the sounds, they documented sudden nighttime drops in air temperature, falls of 8 to 10 degrees Celsius occurring within minutes, without obvious connection to wind, cloud cover, or broader weather shifts. Then, just as suddenly, the temperature returned to normal. The researchers admitted they could not confidently explain the pattern. For local people, this uncertainty only reinforced what they already believed: that some places in the landscape remain hostile to human certainty. The final and perhaps most alarming mystery is not a legend, a ruin, or an archaeological discovery at all. It is a slow-moving disaster taking place in Iran right now. Large parts of the country are sinking. This is not metaphorical. Satellite observations over the last 2 decades have recorded severe land subsidence across major regions of Iran. In some areas, the surface is dropping by 25 to 30 centimeters per year. Over a decade, that means the land can sink by 2 to 3 meters. Long cracks now split roads, fields, foundations, pipelines, and even residential neighborhoods. Buildings lean, walls fracture. In some places, residents have had to be evacuated as homes physically began to descend. The cause is over-extraction of groundwater. Iran is an arid country, and for decades it has relied heavily on wells, both legal and illegal, to support agriculture, urban growth, and daily life. By some estimates, more than 700,000 wells now draw water faster than natural systems can replenish it. When underground aquifers are emptied, the soil and sediment above them lose support and begin to collapse. The terrifying part is that this process happens slowly, silently, and often irreversibly. Even if pumping stopped tomorrow, many aquifer structures would not recover. The geological architecture that held them has already compacted. That is why Iranian scientists describe the crisis as a silent catastrophe. No explosion marks the moment of destruction. There is no single day that enters the history books. The ground simply sinks centimeter by centimeter until damage that seemed impossible suddenly becomes visible. Large parts of the country, including areas near Tehran, Isfahan, and Mashhad, now lie inside zones of serious risk. What makes Iran's hidden stories so striking is not simply that they are strange, but that they all point in the same direction. Again and again, the most disturbing realities lie below the visible surface. A ritual tower in the desert turns out to be a place where the dead were once given to vultures within living memory. A ruined village becomes entangled with geology, gas, fear, and legends of curses. A cave reveals ancient cranial surgery so early and so skillful that modern observers struggle to place it comfortably in the timeline they expect. A great city rests above forgotten plague graves. A quiet yard opens into a buried defensive labyrinth. A mountain gorge produces sounds and temperature shifts that science has not yet fully explained, and an entire modern country begins to sink, slowly and almost silently, because the ground beneath it has been emptied from within. Taken separately, each of these stories would already be unsettling. Together, they create a very different image of Iran from the one most outsiders carry in their heads. This is not only a land of politics, religion, architecture, and poetry. It is also a place where layers of deep time remain active in the present, where old rituals linger near living memory, where buried spaces still reshape modern understanding, and where the ground itself can become unstable in ways both historical and immediate. That layered quality may be the most important thing to understand. Iran is one of those rare places where the distance between past and present feels unusually thin. In many countries, history is divided clearly from daily life, preserved behind museum glass, marked off by fences, or reduced to tourist routes. In Iran, history often remains physically embedded in ordinary space. Dig a foundation trench, open a new road, deepen a well, and something old may appear. A wall, a tunnel, a burial, a forgotten chamber, a layer of bones, or an entire buried system no one expected. This is part of what gives the country its peculiar atmosphere. The past is not inactive there. It continues to press upward through the soil and outward through memory. In some cases, the persistence is cultural. The Towers of Silence were not abandoned in some unreachable ancient age. They remained in use until the 20th century. The people who remember them are not mythical ancestors, but the parents and grandparents of people alive today. That compresses time in an unsettling way. A ritual that sounds almost prehistoric turns out to belong not to distant antiquity, but to living memory. The same compression happens in other forms. The underground city of Nushabad feels like something that should belong to legend, yet it was rediscovered because one man fell through the earth while digging in his own yard. The plague graves around Hamadan sound medieval and remote until modern sewer crews uncover human remains while laying pipes beneath active neighborhoods. The land subsidence crisis sounds like an abstract environmental problem until streets crack, walls split, and families return to homes that have already begun sinking because they have nowhere else to go. That mixture of ancient depth and present urgency is what makes the Iranian landscape so difficult to simplify. It refuses clean categories. A site may be at once archaeological and living, scientific and folkloric, material and spiritual. A cursed village can also sit above a fault emitting gases. A valley associated with jinn can also be a place of measurable acoustic and thermal anomalies. A ritual tower can be both religious infrastructure and a practical response to a theology of purity. The stories do not cancel one another out. They overlap. This overlap is especially visible in the way local people relate to the land. In many modern societies, rational and traditional explanations are expected to compete until one defeats the other. In Iran, those forms of understanding often coexist more quietly. A person may know that sulfurous gases can cause dizziness and hallucinations, and still avoid ruined places after dark out of inherited caution. A shepherd may accept geological explanations for a valley's strange sounds and still refuse to sleep there. This is not necessarily superstition in the simplistic sense outsiders often imagine. It is a form of living with uncertainty in landscapes that have repeatedly justified caution. The archaeological record reinforces that caution by showing how deep and how old some of these uncertainties really are. The trepanned skulls in the cave are a perfect example. The fact that some patients survived means these ancient people possessed procedural knowledge far beyond what many expect from the period. But the setting in which the skulls were found, the arrangement of the remains, and the mix of living surgery and post-mortem cranial opening ensure that the site remains resistant to easy explanation. It is both evidence of advanced prehistoric medical practice and evidence of ritual behavior still not properly understood. The more impressive the skill appears, the stranger the setting becomes. The same can be said of Nushabad. At first glance, an underground city sounds like a marvel of engineering, and it is. But the child's sandal found there changes the emotional balance of the story. It reminds us that such spaces existed because the surface was not safe. Defensive ingenuity is often born from repeated violence. The tunnels, shafts, traps, and ventilation systems are impressive, but they are also the architecture of fear. Their existence tells us that enough people had reason to prepare for slaughter, that they built a city below their own city. Hamadan tells a parallel story in another register. Urban continuity often looks elegant from a distance. A city survives for millennia and historians praise its endurance, but that continuity is often written through repeated death. The forgotten plague pits beneath Hamadan are part of that hidden cost. The city endured not because it escaped catastrophe, but because it recovered from catastrophe again and again, each time bearing one generation under the foundations of the next. The visible city becomes, in a sense, a lid placed over recurrent mass death. And then there is the final mystery, the silent subsidence now affecting modern Iran. This story is perhaps the most disturbing because it is still unfolding. Ancient rituals can be ended, buried cities can be mapped, skulls can be studied. But land subsidence on this scale is harder to dramatize because it does not arrive with spectacle. It works by gradual removal. Aquifers empty, soil compacts, cracks spread, buildings tilt, roads deform. The disaster remains quiet until one day the damage becomes impossible to deny. That silence may be why the crisis feels so eerie. It lacks the drama people associate with catastrophe, yet its consequences are enormous and, in many cases, irreversible. It also ties the entire sequence of stories together with unsettling precision. In each case, the central danger or truth lies underneath. Bodies exposed on towers, gas seeping up through faults, skulls stored in underground chambers, plague pits buried beneath expanding neighborhoods, hidden cities beneath courtyards, strange sounds rising from deep rock, and now empty aquifers collapsing from below. Iran's mysteries are not mainly skyward mysteries, they are downward ones. This gives the country an unusual symbolic coherence. The most frightening things are not always what appears openly. They are what is sealed, buried, hidden in geology, stored in memory, or moving slowly below ordinary sight. The surface can remain beautiful, orderly, even serene, while the deeper story is far more unstable. A turquoise dome, a quiet valley, a sunlit hill, a modern neighborhood, any of them may rest on something older, darker, and harder to explain. That may be why so many of these stories stay with people after they hear them. They are not just accounts of strange places. They are accounts of hidden layers within ordinary reality. They suggest that under beauty there may be ritual violence. Under modern life there may be epidemic graves. Under silence there may be sound. And under solid ground there may be emptiness forming in real time. And yet, there is one more important thing these stories reveal. The people who live in Iran are not crushed by this historical and geological weight. They live with it. They continue making tea, reciting poetry, praying, trading, farming, and building in landscapes full of buried uncertainty. They inherit stories that would sound unbearable elsewhere, and instead of collapsing under them, they fold them into daily life. That may be the most remarkable fact of all. The country is full of places where the surface feels thin, where the past presses close, and where the land itself behaves unpredictably. Yet life continues. So in the end, the seven mysteries do more than expose strange episodes from one country's past. They reveal a way of seeing Iran that most outsiders never develop. Not as a flat political subject, not as a stereotype, and not as a frozen museum of antiquity, but as a living landscape where ancient ritual, geological unrest, forgotten suffering, and modern crisis remain layered together. Iran is a place where the deepest truths are often not visible until something cracks, collapses, or is dug up. And that is what makes it so haunting. Not only that it contains mysteries, but that so many of them are still there, still active, still waiting just below the point where most people stop looking. The farther down you go, the stranger the country becomes.